To study the laws of history, we must completely change the subject of our observation. We must leave aside kings, ministers, and generals, and study the common, infinitesimally small elements by which the masses are moved. No one can say in how far it is possible for a man to advance in this way toward an understanding of the laws of history. But it is evident that only along that path does the possibility of discovering the law of history lie, and that as yet not a millionth part as much mental effort has been devoted to describing the actions of various kings, commanders, and ministers, and propounding reflections of their own concerning these actions. Leo Tolstoy.
At the beginning of the 19th century, Europe was the theatre of political, economic, and military confrontations. At the core of these turbulent times was the Empire of France. The leader of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, went from general to first consul to emperor. At the height of his power, Napoleon reigned over more than half of Europe. The First French Empire included 130 departments and 7 kingdoms. Napoleon controlled Belgium, Holland, the Confederation of the Rhine, Switzerland, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and the Hanseatic coast of Germany, while his brothers and brother-in-law ruled Westphalia, Naples, and northeast Italy. The independent states of Austria, Russia, and Prussia were considered allies. The territory extent was the result of numerous battles throughout the continent. Napoleon's political legitimacy emerged from his glory and victories on the battlefield. Between 1805 and 1807, Russia formed 3 different coalitions with other European countries to fight the French Empire. The 3 battles that took place between the 2 nations were Austerlitz, Eylau, and Friedland. Russia was defeated on all 3 battles. The Grande Armée's technical and strategic superiority was shaped and moulded by the great marshals and generals of the empire. Napoleon relied on these men to lead his armies. All were talented, courageous, and many were heroes.
Napoleon was able to defeat a major coalition of European powers that were arranged against France, scoring one of the greatest military victories in European history at Austerlitz on December 2nd, 1805. And that victory, probably like no other victories that Napoleon scored, gave him this political legitimacy back at home, since it allowed him to justify his imperial claims. It allowed him to create a narrative of France becoming a great nation, and certainly it gave him a mastery of Central Europe, allowing him to start the reorganization process in Germany, consolidate his power in Italy.
The aftermath of France's victory at the Battle of Friedland was followed by the Treaty of Tilsit. The agreements at Tilsit put a temporary end to the confrontations between France and Russia. No Russian territory was occupied. France agreed to help Russia against the Ottoman Empire. Russia agreed to cease trade and economic connections with Britain by joining the Continental Blockade of 1806. Russians were outraged by the treaty that was signed at Tilsit. For many, the Tsar had made an alliance with the Antichrist. By 1810, the lack of British products and merchandise significantly weakened the economic power of European nations. The Russian government lost customs revenue. The Russian nobles, who owned the majority of the forests, lost their primary source of revenue due to the cessation of timber exports, and the Russian merchants lost their profits with a halting of the export of hemp and flax. As a result of these various issues, the Russian national deficit skyrocketed from 7 million rubles in 1801 to 143 million in 1809. As the Russian economic situation worsened, various economic groups within Russia demanded the abrogation of the Tilsit Treaty. The Tsar was determined to protect the population, even if that meant openly defying the Emperor of France. First, he issued a ukase forbidding the import of luxury merchandise, including French merchandise imported from France, such as wine and silks. Second, Alexander decided to admit American and other neutral shipping to northern Russian harbours. This decision circumvented the ban on their entry into its neighbour, the German harbours. The emperor was furious about these two actions, but when he protested, the Tsar replied that France had breached the continental system and allowed limited French exports to England and admitted neutral ships to its own harbours. Your Majesty cannot expect to impose on the Russians, as on the people of Hamburg, privations that you no longer impose on yourself, Alexander said to Napoleon. The defiance of the Tsar was also political. Alexander hoped to gain control of the Danube principalities and Constantinople. He gained the promise from Napoleon that Poland would never be re-established. However, when the Emperor of France seized the German coastal state of Oldenburg, Alexander was deeply resentful. He saw it as an attempt to enlarge the Duchy of Warsaw in order to create a new Polish kingdom. He controlled Finland, which became semi-autonomous with himself as Grand Duke. The relationship between the two men steadily deteriorated. For Alexander, Napoleon was a usurper who betrayed the ideals of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment for personal gain and personal motives. However, he also understood that he could not underestimate the emperor's political skills. By April 27, 1812, Alexander sent a note to Napoleon. He undertook to withdraw his protest about the annexation of Oldenburg, modify his ban on the import of French luxury goods, and reimpose the blockade on English ships, only if Napoleon kept the promise of withdrawing from Prussia. Napoleon saw this note as an ultimatum and declared war on Russia. Napoleon and the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River on June the 22nd, 1812. As he rode down the river looking for a crossing point, his horse shied when a hare shot up between its hooves and threw him. When he remounted his horse, his Brigadier General Ségur turned to him and said, "A Roman would have abandoned the expedition." But the Emperor of France laughed it off and resumed his search of a crossing point. Many saw in this an evil omen. The Battle of Smolensk marked the beginning of the French invasion of 1812. It was fought on August the 17th. The southern suburbs of Smolensk were taken by the French. However, the Grande Armée had been weakened, and the Russians kept possession of the town. The battle was fierce, and the Russians fought with impressive courage. By dusk, Smolensk was a vast conflagration, and Napoleon's advancement towards Moscow was at a great cost. In a letter to Felix Faure, young Stendhal wrote that it was a fine spectacle.
The Russian armies, there were three of them, led by three distinct commanders-in-chief. The first Western Army led by Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, second Western Army led by General Peter Bagration, and the third Army led by Alexander Tormasov. They really had no choice but to fall back, to retreat, facing this massive force led by Napoleon. And we see gradually a Russian strategy emerging of attrition, of slow retreat, of sucking Napoleon's army deeper and deeper into Russia, and trying to find a moment when they will be able to punch back, to fight back. But of course, this strategy is very unpopular, highly unpopular, one must say, with the Russian populace as such, who perceive this as unbefitting the Russian character. The Russian armies tended to pride themselves on being offensive in their character, on being always in favor of attack, and here suddenly, so to speak, the Russians are forced to retreat, and above all, to retreat within their own land, within their own territory, and give up this land to these foreign invaders. And so by August, so it's about a month and a half into the invasion, there is an outcry about this military strategy, and it results in the appointment of a new commander-in-chief to lead all three armies. And that commander-in-chief is General Mikhail Kutuzov, one of the most distinguished Russian commanders of the age, very experienced, very perceptive and smart man. Kutuzov understands that war is not just about maneuvers, about skirmishes and fighting, but it's also about the politics. And he needs to make a decision that will be both appeasing to the populace, to the government, but also that is militarily sound. And so after some consideration, he makes a decision to give a battle to Napoleon at a small village of Mozhaisk / Borodino, which is nowadays on the outskirts of Moscow, but back then it was some distance from the city.
The crash of the French artillery took place at the notable Battle of Borodino, located 200 miles away from Smolensk and 70 miles west of Moscow. In War and Peace, Tolstoy speculates on why the battle was fought at all.
There was not the least sense in it. Its immediate result for the Russians was, and was bound to be, that we were brought a step further toward the destruction of Moscow, and for the French, that they were brought nearer the destruction of their whole army. Leo Tolstoy.
General Field Marshal Kutuzov and his commanders, Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration, had strong positions. However, his army was spread over 5 miles, while Napoleon's army was spread over 2. The French marshals included Ney, Murat, Grouchy, Davout, Poniatowski, and Prince Eugene. On the eve of the battle, the Russian morale was higher than the French. Kutuzov's men were overall fresh and well-nourished. They were fighting to defend their nation. In his proclamation to his men, Kutuzov exacerbated this sentiment of Russian pride.
Trusting on God, we shall either win or die. Napoleon is his enemy. He will desecrate his churches. Think of your wives and children who rely on your protection. Think of your emperor who is watching you. Before the sun has set tomorrow, you have all written on this field the record of your faith and patriotism in the blood of your enemy. General Field Marshal Kutuzov.
The proclamation of Napoleon enticed different emotions in the Grande Armée.
Soldiers, this is the battle you have so much desired. The victory depends upon you. It is now necessary to us. It will give us abundance of good winter quarters and a prompt return to our country. Behave as at Austerlitz, at Friedland, at Vitebsk, at Smolensk, and let the latest posterity recount with pride your conduct on this day. Let them say of you, he was at the battle under the walls of Moscow.
This proclamation was dedicated to alleviating the feelings of homesickness, tiredness and hunger. From 6 a.m. to noon, the fierce fighting seesawed back and forth along the 5-kilometre front. By noon, the French artillery began to tip the scales, but the successive French attacks were not strong enough to overwhelm Russian resistance. Napoleon refused to insert into the fight the 20,000 Imperial Guards and 10,000 other practically fresh troops. Kutuzov had already committed every available man. Thus, Napoleon forfeited the chance of gaining a decisive victory by holding back these men. In the afternoon, the two sides were exhausted, and the battle subsided into the cannonade, which continued until nightfall. As the dusk fell, the two armies rested half a mile apart. Both commanders claimed the victory. Kutuzov's official dispatch announced, "The defeat of Bonaparte in a great battle." However, in his private report to Tsar Alexander, he was more guarded.
Our batteries were captured, then recaptured, but in the end the enemy did not gain an inch of the ground. But Your Majesty will understand that after a battle of such intensity, the line held by us at the start was too long for our reduced forces to hold. So I decided, after passing the night on the battlefield, to withdraw 6 versts. General Field Marshal Kutuzov.
On the French side, Napoleon could claim that at nightfall he remained in occupation of the battlefield, that his guard was intact, and that, as a direct result of the battle, he entered Moscow. He knew that victory is always followed with the negotiations for an armistice, but Russian surrender never came. One can conclude that for Napoleon it was a margin victory on the field, and for Kutuzov it was what Tolstoy described as the kind of victory that compels the enemy to recognize the moral superiority of his opponent.
So in terms of military impact of the Borodino, you don't see the clear-cut impact since Kutuzov understands that even after Borodino, even after this bloody battle, he has no choice but to retreat.
As both armies left Borodino, Napoleon remained in the village of Mauzheysk for 2 days. The Russian army withdrew to Fili, a village close to Moscow and within the sight of the Kremlin wall. Uncertain of what to do next, Kutuzov summoned his generals to his headquarters on September the 13th for the most important military council of the campaign.
Moscow of the gilded cupolas, as the Slav poets say, shone in the sunlight with its 295 churches, its 1,500 castles, its wooden houses in yellow, green, and pink. It lacked only cypress trees and the Bosphorus. The Kremlin formed part of this mass, covered with polished and painted metal. Amongst elegant villas of brick and marble, the Moskva flowed through parks planted with fir, the palm trees of that region. Venus, in the days of its glory, was not more brilliant, rising from the Adriatic wave. Chateaubriand.
With its orchards, gardens, huge bazaars, and its medieval-looking streets, the city of Moscow was full of contrasts. Its character was carefree and unkempt. Unlike most European cities, Moscow lacked public spaces for leisure such as coffee places, libraries, and theatres. The great stone palaces of the nobility were alongside the single-story wooden cabins. At the centre of the city was the Kremlin. There is nothing above Moscow except the Kremlin, and nothing above the Kremlin except heaven, so proclaims an old Russian proverb. Founded by Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, it started as a tiny hamlet on a bend of the Moscow River, which was enclosed with a pine palisade to protect its inhabitants. From the 14th to 17th century, it housed the seats of the nation's government and the Russian Orthodox Church. By the late 17th century, the prominence and purpose of the Kremlin were clearly established. The Tsars were baptized in the Cathedral of the Annunciation, and they later married and were crowned in the same cathedral. They lived in the magnificence of the Terem Palace, and they received dignitaries and nobles in the splendid halls of the Palace of Facets. The Tsars were buried in the silver-domed cathedral of the Archangel Michael. The transformation of the Kremlin into an architectural treasure in the 19th century began when Ivan III united the surrounded lands and proclaimed Moscow the Third Rome. He requested the best artists and architects from Russia and Italy, then commissioned a cluster of churches, cathedrals and palaces. All enclosed the entire complex in red stone walls, studded with imposing turrets. The Kremlin represents Russia's spiritual and secular heritage. With its duality of lofty spirituality and ostentatious materialism, it mirrored Russia itself and contained within its confines the whole epic of the Russian nation and the whole inward drama of the Russian soul.
Every Russian looking at Moscow feels her to be a mother. Every foreigner who sees her, even if ignorant of her significance as the mother city, must feel her feminine character. And Napoleon felt it. Leo Tolstoy.
The rise of modern Russian state is part and parcel of the rise of Moscow. And we can go all the way back to the 13th century, 12th, 13th century, when we see truly the first mention of Moscow as an outpost, a small fortress in the middle of Russia. We can talk about the Mongol invasion, which begins in the 13th century with the Batu Khan, the grandson of Chinggis Khan, leading a massive army into Russia that devastates much of Russian states, but allows the princes of Moscow, who until then played a very meager role in Russian politics, but allowed these princes to emerge as truly power brokers through active cooperation and collaboration with the Mongol power. Indeed, it is using Mongols that Moscow was able to elevate itself above other Russian states. And gradually we see Moscow starting uniting the Russian lands around itself, this process that Russians oftentimes refer to as the gathering of all the Russias. And by 15th century, by 1480s, this process is largely, is mostly complete, with the Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan III, defying Mongols, stopping paying tribute to them, and proclaiming himself the sovereign of all Russias. So in political sense, Moscow is the very heart of Russia. It is the city it is the principality, it is the state that truly created this new, more forceful, more stronger Russia. But part of this story is also the religious dimension. The princes of Moscow understood the importance of religion, and we see in the 14th century the princes of Moscow convincing the religious leaders of Russia, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Metropolitan, to move the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church to Moscow. And so starting in 1326 and forward, we see this seat, or the very center of the Russian religious life, being in Moscow. And that is a very important factor, because by the time we get to the 15th century, and by the time we see Russia freed from the Mongol yoke, what we also see the new narrative emerging, a narrative of Moscow being a third Rome. And that notion, that the concept of Moscow, the third Rome, is a very crucial one, both for religious and political reasons. What this concept refers to is this idea that there were three Romes, three centers of imperial power. The original Rome, which was the heart of the original Roman Empire. Byzantium, or Constantinople, which was the center of the Byzantine Empire. And by 15th century, both of these empires are gone, right? The Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, and then the Byzantine Empire was destroyed by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. But it happened so that the niece of the last Byzantine emperor was married to the ruler of Russia. And so that allowed this ruler, Ivan III, to claim connection, or succession, so to speak, to to the Byzantine Empire. And so we see here the crafting of this message that even though the Second Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, is gone, we see here a third Roman Empire, one that is centered in Moscow, one that can claim inheritance from Roman past, one that is true empire, both in political sense but also in religious sense, because it has this one true faith, the Orthodox Christianity. And so for the next few hundred years, or from 15th century forward, that is the concept that is slowly shaping the Russian society and state. The notion that Russia has a mission to protect the one true faith, a mission to create this bastion in a hostile world.
The city of Moscow had a population of 250,000 people. There was a cohabitation between the rich and the poor, the tradesmen and gentry, the peasants and the artisans. The city was the most cosmopolitan city in Russia, but remained strongly Russian. Its sociology was striking. Nearly half of the Muscovites were serfs. They mostly worked on the land of their lord, but one could also find them working in forests and mines. The middle class was small and represented about 30% of the population of the city. They didn't have extravagant resources or own serfs. However, they had financial means and educational opportunities. The third social group was the aristocracy. They were owners of beautiful palaces and had estates outside of Moscow. They created a cultural elite, strongly westernized and completely disconnected from the rest of the population. The typical aristocrat lived a life of refinement and comfort. He was highly Francophile. He spoke French fluently and attended the French opera and French plays. He had his children brought up by French governesses and tutors who had come from Paris. These French employees were people who had come to Russia with the hope of better economic opportunities and perspectives. The remaining French that resided in Moscow were actors, artists, and shop owners, to name a few. As the Russian and French relationship deteriorated, this small population became strongly ostracized. As for the Muscovite authorities, and the governor in particular, all the French were spies. He wrote to the Tsar, begging him to expel all the French from Moscow. They are harmful to Russia and only waiting for the arrival of Napoleon to proclaim victory. Rid Russia of them, sire, and only keep the ecclesiastics. His request to keep the ecclesiastics was largely due to his close friendship with the Abbé Sergis, the priest of the Church of Saint Louis des Français. The decision to cede Moscow came on September 13, 1812, in the small village of Fili. Kutuzov held a war council with his senior staffs, and after consulting the participants, he decided to concede without fighting. He declared,
To save Russia, we need an army. To save the army, we must give up the idea of defending Moscow. Moscow is not the whole Russia. Better to lose it than the army and Russia. By the virtue of power conferred upon me by the sovereign and the fatherland, I give order to retreat. General Field Marshal Kutuzov.
His aide-de-camp, Prince Galitzin, reports that Kutuzov later said,
I consider this retreat to be providential, for it will preserve our army. Napoleon is like an impetuous torrent, but Moscow will be the sponge that will absorb him.
Mikhail Kutuzov was an old warrior. He was 67 years of age and one-eyed like Hannibal. The great military leader Alexander Suvorov said of him, "Artful, artful, intelligent, intelligent. No one could deceive him." He had the mental makeup of a commander and a keen strategist. Throughout his military career, he was renowned for his perspicacity. The army venerated and adored him. They obeyed him blindly and followed his orders to cede Moscow. His generals, on the other hand, thought that his decision to sacrifice Moscow was pure madness, and one man's hatred for Kutuzov was only exacerbated by this decision. the governor of Moscow, Count Fyodor Rostopchin. Catherine the Great called him Fio the Mad. Rostopchin became governor of Moscow in May 1811. His appointment was mainly due to the Grand Duchess Catherine Pavlovna, Princess of Oldenburg, and younger sister of the Tsar. Just like the governor, she never accepted the alliance that was formed at Tilsit. As the relationship between Napoleon and Alexander worsened, she quickly realized that war was inevitable. In the spring of 1812, she saw as a necessity to have at the head of every city a true patriot. She wrote to Prince Obolensky, "Tell Rostopchin that he must inflame the Muscovite nobility. All he needs to do is to show the danger the fatherland is in and the national significance of this war." Rostopchin tossed aside these instructions very quickly. He spent his time in the salons of Moscow, where he kept repeating, "Napoleon? We won't even let him cross the frontier." But on June the 27th, when the Moscow News informed the readers of Napoleon's entry onto the Russian soil, he cried in a brassy and loud voice, "War? Yes, it's war all right. That doesn't mean that Napoleon will reach Moscow." As the Grande Armée advanced, the governor seemed to remember the instructions of the Grand Duchess. He started working on the minds and spirit of the people to evoke in them preparations for the sacrifice needed for the salvation of the land. When he was summoned to the village of Fili to attend the Council of War on September the 13th, he was sure that it was in order to establish the plan for the defense of Moscow with Kutuzov. At the council, he was told that his town was to be abandoned. He was heard saying to Kutuzov,
"If you leave Moscow without a battle, you will see it in flames after your passage, Governor Rostopchin."
Rostopchin and Kutuzov despised and distrusted each other. The governor was narrow-minded. The general field marshal had a sharp mind. One was shrewd, the other was cunning. Kutuzov had quick perceptions and clear ideas. Rostopchin was high-strung and had woolly ideas. Despite their antagonistic personalities, in 1812 both men were fierce Russian patriots. The Tsar hated both of them, for different reasons. For better or for worse, these two men were destined to deal Napoleon a mortal blow. Various people revealed conversations where the governor had insinuated the burning of the city. The aide-de-camp of Kutuzov, Prince Eugene of Württemberg, recounted a conversation where Rostopchin said,
"If I were consulted, I would not hesitate to say, burn the capital rather than deliver it to the enemy, Governor Rostopchin."
Major General von Betzker heard him say, "It's incredible. It would be a colossal deed, and yet it would be the heroic remedy in the terrible crisis." Words that were quite enigmatic for Betzker, though he understood them later and reported it to Clausewitz. The first people to leave the city were the rich and educated, who could not tolerate French rule in Moscow. Some of them left before Borodino, and others after. Families left Moscow on their own account, leaving behind their property and their belongings. The nobility could have stayed in Moscow, could have accepted the occupation of the French, but they chose to abandon their homes. One could qualify this act as the birth of Russian patriotism. The Muscovites understood that the war against the French needed to be fought by the army, and went away without thinking of the tremendous significance of abandonment of the wealthiest city in Russia. The core of the evacuation was as a mass exodus. From the 28th to the 31st of August, the families focused on packing as quickly as possible. Furniture was being carried out, and the mirrors and pictures were taken down. Wrapping paper and cards were scattered about. Boxes were filled with china, bronzes, jewellery, paintings, books, and other belongings. The yards were filled with noise and turmoil. Thousands of carriages and carts were aligned in the streets, as families filled it with their household belongings, hoping to take with them as much as possible. When some could not take their belongings, they buried them, while others walled them up, leaving behind what could not be taken. Carriages, carts, and other trains of vehicles formed 2 rows abreast, as they were headed to the gates of the city. The city emptied hourly, as the common people left Moscow on foot, on horseback or cart, carrying their children in their arms, pushing their belongings in wheelbarrows. Feeling helpless, they dispersed in various directions. They feared the brutality of the arrival of the Grande Armée. By that point of the evacuation, Governor Rostopchin officially ordered everyone to leave the city. Many people also heard the earlier rumours that Moscow would be set on fire. Of a population of 250,000 residents, approximately 25,000 people had remained in Moscow when the French arrived, and they were people of the lowest class, criminals, foreigners, and those sick and wounded who were too weak to leave. The night of September 13th, the governor summoned Ivashkin, the chief of police, to his mansion and ordered him to have all the fire engines covered with matting and put on the road to Ryazin. The fire engines, for which there was no time to remove, were to be destroyed. On the same evening, he ordered the police officers to close the taverns, break the barrels of vodka, and burn the fire brigade's lighters moored alongside the quays. And simultaneously he ordered the doors of the prisons to be opened early the next morning. Once they followed through on these instructions, the municipal police, along with the fire brigade, were to leave the city at dawn. On the morning of September 14th, the tasks given by Rostopchin the previous evening were to be accomplished by police officers disguised as beggars and workmen, and by the released prisoners who were promised amnesty in exchange for this great patriotic act in service to the holy cause of the fatherland. These people were all supplied with Congreve rockets and all the necessary materials, including a small round metal plaque the size of a crown, so that they could recognize each other.
If Moscow could not perish like a soldier, defending himself with arms in hand, it should succumb as an expiatory victim, immolated for the salvation of the fatherland, for the destruction of the ungodly. Governor Rostopchin.
As he was leaving Moscow for Ryazin, the governor turned to his eldest son, Sergei, and said,
"Salute Moscow for the last time. In an hour it will be in flames."
It was at 2 in the afternoon, on the 14th of September, that Bonaparte, by the light of a sun glittering with polar diamonds, saw his new conquest. Moscow, like a European princess at the edge of his empire, adorned with all the riches of Asia, seemed there for marriage with Napoleon. Chateaubriand.
Napoleon arrived at Poklonnaya Gora and caught sight of the city for the first time. He rode to Sparrow Hill, where the view across the Moskva towards the Kremlin was spectacular. He took some time to look at the myriad domes, spires, and gilded palaces below him. The golden domes of Moscow were a short ride away, and soon he would claim the splendid capital and would be greeted with deference by an emissary of the people. But there was no emissary to welcome him, No people to witness his entrance into the city. Ornate palaces, sturdy homes, narrow streets, and broad avenues were all silent. The Grande Armée entered the city only to the echoing sound of their own footsteps.
In truth, the issue hung on a very small matter. For I had set out to fight men under arms and not raging nature. I defeated armies, but I could not conquer the flames. Napoleon Bonaparte, Memorial of St. Helena.
On the afternoon of September 14th, 1812, the Emperor of France was surrounded by his top generals and marshals. Around him were Joachim Murat, King of Naples, Marshal Berthier, Prince of Neuchâtel and Wagram, Prince Eugene, Viceroy of Italy, Marshal Davout, Prince of Eckmühl, Duroc, Marshal of the Palace, and Marshal Mortier, Duke of Treviso. Also by his side, General Lauriston, General Gourgaud, and finally General Armand de Caulaincourt, Duke of Vicenza. Caulaincourt served Napoleon as Master of the Horse, political advisor and ambassador to Russia in St. Petersburg, and twice as Minister of Foreign Affairs. His memoirs provide an extensive account of the events that took place in Moscow in the course of the next 3 days. In the evening of September 14th, small fires broke out in a few shops in the Grand Bazaar. Simultaneously, additional outbreaks of fire broke out in the suburbs at some distance from where the emperor was quartered. These small outbreaks did not cause great damage, and therefore little importance was attached to them. They were attributed to negligence in lighting campfires, and orders were given to redouble vigilance. Napoleon appointed Marshal Mortier as governor of Moscow. Tranquility in the vast city was somewhat ensured. The flames flared up again along Pokrova Street, a long street that ran through a vast district in the east. Prince Sergei Trubetskoy's mansion burned down. Concurrently, the houses located on the Arбate to the west of the Kremlin also burned. The fire then broke out on the boulevard that led to the Dorogo-Milavo Gate. From the eastern districts, the black whirlwinds of smoke had spread over the town. The smell of sulphur and bitumen was everywhere. The fire expanded with everything that it devoured. The reserves of wheat along the banks of the Moskva blazed up, and the bonfire sparks spread, falling on a stock of grenades, which then blew up. The bazaar reignited, and within a few minutes the stores of oil and tallow became an inextinguishable furnace. That evening the emperor retired early. Caulaincourt recalls,
Around 10:30 p.m. my valet woke me up with the news that for 3/4 of an hour the city had been in flames. I had only to open my eyes to realize that this was so, for the fire was giving off so much light that it was bright enough to read in the middle of my room.
Caulaincourt sent out his valet to wake Marshal Duroc. Word was then sent out to Mortier to put the guard under arms. Caulaincourt decided to let the emperor sleep a bit longer.
I mounted my horse hurriedly to go and see what was happening, to gather what assistance I could muster, and to make sure that everyone connected with my own department, scattered throughout the city as they were running no unnecessary hazards. A stiff wind was blowing from the north, from the direction of the 2 points of conflagration that we could see, and was driving the flames towards the center, which made the blaze extraordinarily powerful.
Towards 12:30, a fire broke out to the west. The city became an inferno. The remaining Muscovites fled their houses and gathered in churches. Since the previous day searches for fire engines had been made, some were put out of action and the rest were taken away.
About 4 a.m., the conflagration was so widespread that we judged it necessary to wake the emperor, who at once sent more officers to find out how things really stood and discover whence these fires could be starting. General Caulaincourt.
At the sight of the disaster caused by the fire, the emperor was furious, and when he heard about the looting around the bazaar, he cursed the troops' lack of discipline. As reports were getting dispatched to Napoleon, he came to realize that the orders were given by the governor of police to set the whole town on fire during the night. According to Caulaincourt, some Polish soldiers from the Grande Armée caught some of the incendiaries and killed them.
The emperor was deeply concerned. He left the courtyard of the Kremlin on foot, just when 2 more incendiaries, caught in the act, were being brought in. When interrogated in the presence of the emperor, they repeated their declarations. Their commanding officer had ordered them to burn everything. Houses had been designated to this end.
All the incendiaries were kept under observation. A few were brought to judgment, and between 8 and 10 were executed. The flames continued spreading, now reaching the houses around the Kremlin. The wind fanned the flames to a terrifying extent and carried gigantic sparks over distance. According to Caulaincourt, the flames fell like a fiery deluge a few hundred yards away, setting fire to more houses and preventing even the most intrepid from remaining in the neighborhood safely. This uncontrollable conflagration ignited the beams supporting the iron plates, which formed the roof of the arsenal, and it all caught fire. The roof of the Kremlin kitchen was saved by men who were placed there with buckets and brooms to gather up the glowing fragments and moisten the beams. The fire progressed to the south of the Kremlin, and then fanned out to the northern and the greater part of the western quarter. From there, the flames continued to spread. No one could predict when they would stop. The conflagration went beyond the Kremlin.
About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, while the fire was still raging, the emperor began to think that this great catastrophe might be connected with some movement of the enemy, even though frequent reports from the King of Naples assured him that the Russians were still retreating along the Kazan road. The emperor therefore gave orders to leave the city and forbade anything to be left within its walls. General Caulaincourt.
The emperor and his men established their headquarters at the Petrovskoy Palace on the Petersburg Road, a country mansion where the Tsars were accustomed to take up residence before making their solemn entries into Moscow for their coronations. They arrived there in the evening, and they spent the following day in the palace. The emperor was deep in thought. He spoke to no one. On awakening the next morning of the 17th of September, Napoleon looked anxiously toward Moscow, hoping to find that the conflagration had subsided. But he saw it still raging as violently as ever. The whole city seemed one vast swirling column of fire, towering into the sky and dyeing it with lurid colours. Sunk in gloomy contemplation, he kept a long, mournful silence, which he broke, at length, by exclamation, "This forebodes great misfortune for us." The fall of sheets of metal and pinewood beams, the collapse of whole facades, and the cries of people and animals, a deafening din unbroken for 48 hours, and all the more impressive because it followed immediately on the heels of the unusual silence of the great abandoned city. During the night of the 17th, heavy rain began to fall on Moscow, largely reducing the fire without totally extinguishing it. The fire at its height lasted from the 15th to the 18th. The larger stone houses escaped, but of others all that remained were chimneys. A great portion of the city was reduced to ashes. The northern district nearest the Kremlin had been saved by the wind shifting to the west. Some isolated districts to windward didn't suffer at all and completely escaped the flames. On the morning of Friday, September 18th, the Emperor ordered an immediate return. Upon this gloomy prospect, Caulaincourt recalls,
I was overwhelmed. Happy are they who never saw that dire spectacle, that picture of destruction.
The surrender of Moscow horrified the entire Russian nation. And although the Tsar was overwhelmed with grief, he never ceased to reassure the people and inspire them with courage to resist. He made sure that the people understood that the enemy's entry into Moscow does not mean the conquest of Russia. In a message dated September the 15th, he sent a report to Kutuzov accompanied by a manifesto.
The enemy entered Moscow on September the 15th. The dismay that was shown on every face will be understood. But far be it from us to exhibit pusillanimous dejection. Let us rather redouble our perseverance and our courage. Let us hope that by fighting for a just cause, we shall hurl back on the enemy all the misfortunes he wants to heap on us. Tsar Alexander I.
Alexander was not informed of the fire until September the 20th. To reassure his country, he described how Napoleon personified the evils of the human race, and how the calamities of war and the cruelties could be braved by the Russian people. The Tsar understood that the Russian people needed to fully understand and assimilate that the defense of their land was a righteous cause tied to immortal honor. Resisting the invader with constancy and courage would lead to a lasting peace for the entire continent. Alexander also focused on the holy dimension of the war and his invocation to the Almighty to preserve the nation, which resonated deeply with his subjects.
Almighty God, is not the cause for which we fight a just one? Cast a merciful eye on thy holy church. May it triumph over its and thy adversary. May it be in thy hands the instrument of his destruction, and by delivering itself, redeem the liberty and independence of nations and kings.
The ultimate sacrifice, which was the abandonment and the burning of the city that is considered the heart of Russia, is, without a doubt, a founding element of modern Russian patriotism. The emperor faced a great dilemma. On one hand, he promised his men a prompt return to France. On the other hand, he refused to leave Moscow without having signed the preliminaries to peace. For Napoleon, this looks like a political defeat. His hope was that the Tsar would offer peace now that his religious city was captured. He was willing to re-establish a relationship with the Tsar on the conditions agreed at Tilsit. He profoundly misunderstood the Tsar's character. Caulaincourt had warned him that Alexander was tenacious, and that if he ever bargained with the nation's enemy, he would have risked his throne and perhaps his life. Caulaincourt understood early on that there was no possibility for a compromise. Napoleon's 3 appeals for peace remained unanswered. Each appeal reinforced the Tsar's belief the Emperor of France was in deep trouble. Napoleon then considered to march to St. Petersburg, but then gave way to his marshal's objections. Additional options remained, from advancing eastward into central Russia to staying in Moscow all winter and attacking St. Petersburg in the spring, to retreating to Smolensk or Vitebsk and start a campaign in 1813. The most tempting plan was to spend winter in Moscow, but there were 2 major drawbacks to that option. He had an entire empire to rule and could not be absent from Paris for 6 months. The second drawback was the supply would get worse. Caulaincourt warned him that with winter arriving, he was in a position of great danger. Napoleon replied that the climatic conditions were much exaggerated. The Emperor finally reached a firm decision on October the 17th. There was only one way to do this. He must attack Kutuzov, defeat him, and take the Grande Armée into winter quarters further west. Moscow would be yielded back to Russia, but at a greater cost to them than to himself. His goal was to save his army in such a way that he could claim that his political strength was undiminished. The retreat began on October the 19th, 35 days after the French had entered Moscow. As winter arrived and extreme cold settled, Napoleon watched the Grande Armée disintegrate. Of the 500,000 men he had entered Moscow with, only 93,000 survived the retreat. Charles Talleyrand said, "It was the beginning of the end." He abandoned his army and regained Paris. The remainder of 1812 and the year of 1813 would be the precursor to the first abdication, which came in 1814, and the second and final abdication in 1815. The evacuation and the burning of Moscow was undeniably a turning point in the fall of the Bonaparte Empire. Moscow's very misfortune, as Madame de Staël brilliantly said, regenerated the Russian Empire. That holy city perished like a martyr, whose blood once shed grants new strength to the brothers who survive her.